Howdy again everyone, and today I have something unusual for you all, the Canon EF 22-55mm f4 to 5.6 USM. It is a somewhat unusual lens that was first marketed in March 1998 to be a kit lens for Canon's fairly short-lived Advanced Photo System SLR cameras with their convenient little film cartridges which are smaller and lower quality than 35mm film. The whole system didn't really take off. The original APS film system had a crop factor of about 1.25 times that of full frame film with a wider aspect ratio of 16:9, the same as a standard widescreen TV, so this lens's zoom range would have been the equivalent of about 28 to 69mm on an old APS camera, but it also provides full coverage on full frame, so perhaps, who knows, it might be somewhat useful to people today as a basic, lightweight, emergency zoom lens with an extra wide angle to it. You can find these on eBay for 50 quid or so. I would like to say a big thank you to Tex Mex, one of my Patreon supporters over in the States. Not only did he send me this curious little thing for testing, but also he supports my channel. Remember, for $3 a month on Patreon you can do that too, as well as getting some fun monthly exclusive videos. Thanks Tex Mex. He sent me this cool lapel pin too, which officially makes me an FBI agent. I'm now overseeing a sleeper cell here in Wales, spying on all those sheep. Let's get back to the lens. Its build quality is very cheap and lightweight, even down to there being a plastic lens mount. Haven't seen one of those in a while. There are quite a few reports of these lenses' electronics failing out in the wild, although this one did seem to work okay. The zoom ring is rubberized, and on this one it didn't turn smoothly at all, feeling really quite rough and sticky. The manual focus ring at the front is narrow and plastic, and it should only be turned when the lens is switched to manual focus mode, or you could damage the mechanism. Worse is that the front of the lens rotates as you change focus, making it a pain to use with polarizing or graduated filters. In this footage you can see me adjusting the focus, and you can also see the effect of my polarizing filter making the sky change brightness as the front of the lens turns around. You can also observe a lot of focus breathing here. Now here's the autofocus motor in action. It uses one of Canon's old micro USM motors, so it does work fairly quickly but with a quiet whooshing sound. When adapted onto my EOS R5 camera, it focused pretty accurately. Canon EOS R cameras are very good at doing that with older lenses. The lens does not have image stabilization, although it does transmit EXIF information to your camera, so that will help your camera if it has in-body stabilization. Its filter thread size is 58mm wide. Overall, this is a typical little Canon kit lens from the 1990s. It is functional and lightweight, but otherwise pretty old-fashioned. Now, let's take a look at image quality. A moment ago you saw it mounted onto my old Canon 6D, but for these tests I've adapted it onto my 45MP full-frame EOS R5, as I mentioned before. The camera did not have corrections available for this lens, so there are no corrections this time. At 22mm and f4, there is a decent level of sharpness in the middle of the image, but contrast seems to have completely bottomed out. Over in the corners, there's still some level of sharpness there, but it is clouded over by that terrible contrast and very strong chromatic aberration. Stop down to f5.6 for a lot more brightness in the corners and a little more contrast there too. Back in the middle, we now get very impressive sharpness and contrast. F8 looks just as good as it did before in the middle and in the corners, and there are no further improvements as you stop down the aperture more. Now let's zoom into 35mm, where the maximum aperture has darkened to f5. Again, we see good resolution, clouded over by terrible contrast. The corners look a little better than before, but still the contrast is just so low. Here is f8, a little more brightness and contrast can be seen in the corners, and excellent contrast now back in the middle again. Stopping down the lens further doesn't bring any improvements. Finally, let's zoom all the way into 55mm. This time, at f5.6, the low contrast is intertwined with low sharpness, and the corners about the same. Stop down to f8 for a little more contrast in those corners and a little more sharpness and contrast back in the middle, although it's still a bit weak. F11 finally looks quite good in the middle, and over in the corners just okay. Overall, it is a pretty weak performance from this lens. Unless you stop it down to f8 or f11, it's just not producing the contrast you need for vibrant photography. Now let's take a look at distortion and vignetting. The lens projects a lot of barrel distortion at 22mm, and the edges look very dark at f4, although in fairness to the lens's designers, it was intended for use on a camera system where they would have been cropped out. Stop down to f5.6 or f8 for some more brightness in those corners. Zoom in to 35mm to see that distortion straighten out, and at 55mm it flips into quite strong pincushion distortion with a little vignetting in the corners. Even if you stop down to f11, that vignetting remains in the corners. This lens can focus as closely as 35cm to your subject, which is pretty useful. At f5.6, close-up image quality is quite soft with, again, very low contrast. Stop down to f8 and that contrast improves, but this is as sharp as you can get when shooting closely. When it comes to flaring, generally the lens loses some contrast when bright lights get into your pictures, but there isn't too much flaring at wider angles. Zoom in a bit and a little more flaring emerges, but it's nothing too horrendous. And finally, bokeh. Because of this lens's dark maximum aperture, it's really quite difficult to get out of focus backgrounds here, even on a full frame camera, unless you're zooming in quite close to your subject. The quality of its bokeh is just average. Occasionally it's on the busy side, occasionally nice and soft. Overall, this lens proves itself to be usable on a full frame camera, but you probably wouldn't want to. The standout problem with it is its very low contrast, but vignetting and distortion also take their toll, as well as low quality bokeh, not that it is very easy to get out of focus backgrounds. This lens is a minor historical curio, but the main interest in it for me came in its demonstration of just how far technology has pushed things forward over the past 20 years. Thanks again to Tex Mex for sending the lens, and I hope this review doesn't damage its resale value too much for you if you want to list it on eBay, and I'll see you all next time.